Hello and welcome to Women in Music. This is the third part of our series entitled Women as Composers. Dr. Tsu-Hwa Ho and I are excited to welcome you to today's performance and hope very much that you enjoy the variety of songs that we have chosen from different women composers who lived and worked in the United States and in Europe. Certainly there were other women composers of note who worked and lived in other places in the world, but today we've decided to focus on these particular women as their music was readily available to us. And considering that women composers throughout history have been maligned, it is sometimes difficult to get your hands on the actual sheet music to perform it. So we have done what we could and hope that you enjoy the selections we have made. We, however, cannot go on without saying that it is so important for us to be doing this program to really acknowledge the importance of women's contribution as composers to music history, simply because during their lifetime they often were barred from many opportunities and given a super hard time, of course more so than their male counterparts, simply because they were women. Unfortunately, this has been historically the case in other disciplines besides music, but in music that was also happening. And so we want to acknowledge that the works of these women composers were just as important as their male counterparts and just as worthy and valuable of being honored and respected and being performed. And so that's what we'd like to do in today's performance, and we hope that you enjoy it. The first composer whose work we will hear today is Eva Delacroix, a Belgian-born composer in Brussels and who also died there at the age of 74. She was the daughter of an Italian painter, Cesare, and her mother, Carolina van der Elst. She composed as many as 15 operas and operettas, as well as orchestral works, chamber music, pieces for piano, and lots of songs. She premiered a lot of these pieces at her parents' home because, of course, as was typical of the day, they didn't want their daughter out in society without supervision, so they did a lot of things at home, but for the public, and so through that her music became known. 5 of her works she sang the soprano lead role in, and received fame for that, as well as having a really successful time of making a living as a composer, simply because during her lifetime, Schott, the music publisher in Brussels, published 50 of her works, and many of her works were recorded. In fact, 5 of her most famous pieces were recorded on 33 different records during her lifetime. And the piece you'll hear today, Villanelle, was recorded in 1911 on Victor Records by 2 famous singers, Frieda Hempel and Gali Corci Amelita. And it was on 2 film soundtracks in the same year of 1942. And it is still very popular because it is a coloratura soprano showpiece, and there are actually over 100 different videos of this piece on YouTube with various soloists. So if you're curious, you can check them out later. The next work we will be hearing is from composer Antonia Bembo, who was born in Venice and who died in Paris at the age of 72. She was the daughter of a doctor, Giacomo Paduani, who was desirous of having a court position in Mantua. And because his daughter had such an incredible musical talent at such a young age and such a beautiful voice, he decided to use her as the instrument through which he would win favor in that court. But she obviously had objected, and there was proof historically that many times he had threatened to disown her and disinherit her for her disobedience in not being willing to go along with this plan. Whatever the case, she had kind of a difficult relationship with her father, and then later on she had a difficult relationship with her husband. She studied composing with Francesco Cavalli, who was a renowned Italian composer of the time and who also taught a contemporary of hers, another female composer, Barbara Storazzi. She married later Lorenzo Bembo, whose family was one of the noble families of Venice, one of the Case Vecchie, and he was not a very nice husband. He had several affairs with people who worked in their household, and after their third child was born, he just up and left for 5 years for military duty without thinking of providing financially for his family. So Bembo was in a little bit of a difficult spot, and she tried to get a divorce, but to no avail. However, later on, her husband ended up spending the last 13 years of his life in jail for embezzlement, so karma did get him in the end. But in 1676, she decided to escape her life with him and to move to Paris with a friend of hers who was a guitar teacher. But before that, she safely deposited her only daughter in a convent in Venice so that she would be cared for. Once in Paris, she was a music teacher, and then she finally had an opportunity to perform for King Louis XIV. And she did so singing, and he loved her voice so very much that he decided to give her a court pension and put her up to live, compose, and sing however and whenever she wanted at a convent in Paris. So that's where she lived the remainder of her life, composing whatever work she wanted, most of them, of course, for her voice type, which was soprano and continuo. And she composed 6 volumes of arias, motets, cantatas, and an opera. And many of these works, of course, she dedicated to her very generous patron. Hopefully you're excited to hear Antonia's next piece. The next piece we'll hear is from Josefina Lang, who was born in Munich and who died in Tübingen at age 65. She was born into an incredibly musical family with many, many members of her family on her mother's and father's side as professional musicians, and if not, then as creative individuals. And her husband was also an amateur poet, even though he made his living as a professor of law later on. At age 3, she attended the opera with her parents and said that that was one of her most influential musical experiences. And at age 5, she began composing. She didn't have a formal musical education, but with all of those musical people in the household and with a piano at her disposal, she kind of did her own thing, actually. Her first piano lessons were with her mother, of course, and then with one of Munich's best piano teachers, Josefine Berlinghof. And at age 11, because she made such quick progress, she gave her first public performance with the Munich Museum Society of her own works, and she was labeled a child prodigy. At age 13, she wrote her first song, or her first Lied. She published over 100 songs in her lifetime, but she wrote over 300 total, as well as some choral works and some piano pieces. And at age 15 and 16, when Felix Mendelssohn was in town, he met her and heard some of her pieces and was just blown away by them, so much so that he offered to be her composition teacher, which he didn't just offer to anybody. And he actually wrote wonderful letters about how great she was to his sister Fanny Mendelssohn. Then in 1837, one of her pieces was published in Robert Schumann's Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, and that helped to disseminate her fame further and make her songs more popular. And she married Reinhold Köstlin, who was the amateur poet, and unfortunately, though, she was widowed quite early at 41. They had 6 children together, so because she was widowed so early, she needed a way to make ends meet. How happily, she was friends with Clara Schumann and also a man named Ferdinand Hiller, who was a conductor, as well as a composer. And she wrote to both of them describing her situation, and immediately Clara gave a benefit concert because she was just so kind and wonderful and helped to support Josephine in that way. And Mr. Hiller wrote an astonishingly spectacular biography and sent it to the publisher for her, and thus they published her works right away, which was wonderful, so she could make some money. And even as recently as last March, she was celebrated on her 205th birthday with a Google Doodle. The work we will hear next is from a composer who I am lucky enough to know personally and call a friend, and that is Gloria Coates. She is an American composer who was born in Wausau, Wisconsin, the second of 3 children, and who currently lives in Munich, Germany, and has so since 1969. Her father, Roland Kannenberg, was a politician, and her mother, Natalie Zanin, was a singer. She actually had her very first musical instruction with her mother, and then she studied formally piano and voice with private teachers. When, at age 12, she won a composition competition for her first song, this spurred her to then, at age 14, take composition lessons with Alexander Cherepnin in Chicago. And even though he thought that she had incredible potential, she at the time actually still wanted to become a singer or an actor. But she studied then later on at Monticello College, at Cooper Union Art School in New York City, at Louisiana State University, and at those places she then earned her Bachelor of Arts in Theater and Art and an additional Bachelor of Arts in Composition and in Voice. She got her master's degree at Columbia University with honors while studying composition there with the composer Otto Luening, and then later Jack Beeson was a composer teacher. She is actually a composer, a painter. She does abstract expressionist paintings, oftentimes which you will see as the covers of her CDs. And she is also a singer, an actor, and a lecturer. She has done a number of incredible things. She organized the German-American Music Series, championing the works of American composers in Europe. She has produced radio broadcasts for stations in Munich and Bremen and in Cologne. She wrote musicological articles, and she has been a lecturer on her pieces and her compositional technique and style at so many incredible places, at Harvard, at Princeton, and also in places just internationally, in India and Germany and Ireland, Poland, and in the UK. She is the composer of the most symphonies of any woman composer. She's composed 16, and many of them which have been recorded and put out on CD. She composed chamber music as well, many string quartets, a lot of which have been premiered by the Jack Quartet or performed in general. She's written electronic music and she's written solo vocal pieces, a lot for the lyrics of Emily Dickinson, and one of which you will hear today. In 1978, she got her big breakthrough when her music on open strings premiered in Warsaw, Poland. And since the 1970s, she has been, say many critics, one of the most original compositional voices nowadays. She shows her prowess not only in her incredible symphonic works in big forms, but then also in smaller, more personal forms like her songs. So, let's hear one. We'll hear a piece next from Alma Mahler, who was born in Vienna and who died in New York at 85. She was the daughter of a famous landscape painter, Emil Schindler, and of a famous opera singer mother, Anne-Sophie Moll. She was reputed to be very, very beautiful, but she was also well educated, even though she was only tutored at home. And she was well-traveled, and she was very worldly because the friends of her parents often came to visit, and they were creative people from all over Europe, and so she learned quite a great deal from them. At age 9, she began her composing, and in the year 1900, she began composing studies with Alexander Zemlinsky, who would later become the teacher of Arnold Schoenberg. She also fell slightly in love with Zemlinsky, although they never had a formal relationship as girlfriend and boyfriend, and he was not always a very supportive composition teacher to her. He let her believe the societal ideas of the time that women were not suited to composing, and so it was often that she wrote in her journal things like she was very frustrated with her composing, or for example when she says, "My work is a complete failure. Why must I be blessed with this little bit of talent?" And she had kind of a difficult relationship with her composing because she wanted so much to compose, but yet she was kind of blocked at every turn by the men in her life that she encountered, and also by societal expectations. In 1901, she married Gustav Mahler, who was 20 years older than her, and he encouraged her to stop composing. He actually asked her to in a letter, and she agreed to it, although she never forgave him really for it. And he encouraged her to see his works as her own works. Of course, she became the copier of many of his works and prepared them for publication and did a lot of important things to help his pieces get known. Yet, only it was after 10 years of marriage, which was quite tumultuous, that he helped her to publish the first set of 5 of her songs, and 1 year later he died quite suddenly. 17 of her songs are all that remain of her output, unfortunately. She destroyed a lot of them, and they were published in her lifetime, these 7 pieces. She was married to 3 very notable but very different men, Mahler, and then Walter Gropius, an architect, and then Franz Werfel, an author, and you can kind of see that she was very influential in the output of these men, as well as she was involved with the painter Oskar Kokoschka, and she had children from all of these different men. It was kind of incredible that she was able to manage all of these different relationships and yet still have a compositional output, and she composed also after Mahler had passed. She was painted in a painting by Gustav Klimt, who was a childhood friend, and she was also painted, of course, in many paintings and drawings by Oskar Kokoschka, and in 1946 she gained her United States citizenship. So Alma was definitely a woman of the world who had something to say, and we will certainly hear that in this next piece. The next composer whose music you'll be hearing is Cécile Chaminade. She was born in Paris and she died in Monte Carlo at the age of 87. Her family was one of amateur musicians, and her mother, who was a pianist and singer, was her first teacher. They happened to live as close neighbors to Georges Bizet in a Paris suburb, and so they were acquainted with him. And when Cécile was brave enough, a year after she began composing, She was 8 at the time that she showed Bizet some of her first pieces. And he was so impressed with them that he began to call her the nickname of Little Mozart, and to try to impress upon her father the importance of her studying at the Paris Conservatory. Yet, her father, like many men of the time, was relatively conservative in his view of a woman's role in society, and so he didn't like the idea of his little Cecile studying at a public school with boys together, being maybe the only girl. And so they did kind of a compromise where Cecile was able to study privately with the professors of the music conservatory so that she could study still a formal music education, but maybe not in a public sphere. So at age 18, she gave her first concert at home of her compositions, and it was, of course, open to the public, so many people attended. And after that, she was quite renowned, and this enabled her to take a tour concertizing to London, where she received an audience with Queen Victoria. And she really enjoyed her music, and this only bolstered her popularity and fame. In her lifetime, she composed 3 symphonies, a comic opera, a ballet, chamber music, one piece of which is still very famous with flute players and is simply called the Chaminade because it's so challenging and virtuosic. And she also wrote about 150 mélodies, which is just the way of saying a song with a poetic text set to music, or which we would term nowadays art song, but specifically in French. So at age 44, she married Louis Carbonel, one of the most important French music publishers of the time, and this helped her to widely disseminate her pieces and to publish quite a lot of them. This also helped her to make her living as a composer solely, which was pretty impressive for a woman of that time, and for anybody, as a matter of fact. So she was doing quite well. Then in 1908, she undertook her first trip to the USA, where she had 2 Carnegie recitals, and she helped to inspire 200 clubs in her honor to be formed. These were simply called Chaminade clubs, and where lots of her music was performed and talked about by women and by men, although mainly women were in the clubs because, of course, they didn't maybe have previous entree into society to do things like perform music in public. So she kind of opened doors for a lot of women in this country too, musically, which was really cool. Then in 1913, the kind of pièce de résistance of her life's work and in being validated by the French government happened when she was awarded the Légion d'honneur, when she was the first female composer to receive this award, and it's an award given by the government to symbolize and to signify the importance of work done by a person working in their field for more than 20 years. So this was a really, really important honor, and it was pretty wonderful that they decided to bestow it upon her. She has been quoted as saying something which I'd like to share with you now that I find to be very insightful, and I think she was right, and I hope that this continues to be the case. And she said about herself when she was asked about being a woman and being a composer. She said, "There is no sex in art. Genius is an independent quality. The woman of the future, with her broader outlook and her greater opportunities, will go far, I believe, in creative work of every description." So not only was she an incredible composer, but she was also quite a smart person. All right, here's L'été from Cécile Chaminade. This next person we'll hear a piece from is Clara Schumann. She was born in Leipzig and she died in Frankfurt at the age of 77. She was born to Marianne Tromlitz, who was a singer and a pianist, and Friedrich Wieck, who was a piano teacher and who also sold pianos. Unfortunately, her parents' marriage didn't work out, and even though her piano studies began with her mother, at the age of 5, her father took over her piano studies when her mother moved out. She gave her first concert as a child prodigy at the age of 9 at the Leipziger Gewandhaus, and that, of course, included at the time performing pieces that she herself had composed, as was expected of performers of the day. And she was quite famous and admired for that, and because of that, this basically secured her child prodigy status, which was what her father had wished for. Unfortunately, her future husband, Robert, with whom she had been acquainted since age 8 when he moved into their family house to study with her father, piano lessons, didn't think that her pieces were so spectacular because they were just variations of more pieces that were popular at the time, which actually many professional performers did. So Robert was just basically being a snob because he said, oh, since these pieces are only for virtuosic showmanship, they're not meaningful in an intellectual way, musically speaking. So Clara was not always incredibly supported by Robert in her composing because he didn't view it as worthy as his own pieces, which were made for a deeper purpose, he said. However, because she was such an amazing pianist, she kept their family life together and created the money with which they kept a roof over their head. They had together 8 children, her and Robert, and even though her father had initially disapproved of the match, he eventually came around, but Clara was the one who kept it all together. Her concertizing throughout all of Europe as a solo pianist and as one of the most famous musicians of her time, she was as popular as Liszt in terms of attending concerts. She was equally sold out, she was equally famous, and she was a woman, and she was doing all of this and having all of these children and managing a household and having a composer husband who had frequent breakdowns mentally because he had earlier contracted syphilis and the disease was kind of wearing on him. So she had a lot of things to manage, but she somehow kept it all together. And on top of that, she composed orchestral pieces, songs, piano concerti, trios, and solos for piano, chamber music, and arrangements of pieces by her husband and by Brahms. So she was the authoritative editor of her husband's works, and she had a 61-year concert piano career as a soloist and chamber musician. And later on, she taught at a music conservatory in Frankfurt. She was also honored posthumously on the 100 Deutschmark bill, which is not anymore in circulation, but which was pretty darn cool. And I think she deserved that and much more. So let's hear her piece. The next composer whose work we will hear is Liza Lehmann. She was born in London and she died also in the UK in a small town named Pinner at the age of 56. She was born into an artistic and musical family. Her father, Rudolf, was a German painter, and her mother, Amelia Chambers, was a music teacher, a composer, and an arranger. Although she didn't actually have a whole lot of success with it, unfortunately. However, in her daughter, she did have some success. So that's nice that the next generation was able to achieve perhaps what the previous could not. And in her youth, Liza lived in Germany, France, and Italy because her parents were artists and musicians and they went where the work was. But she had dedicated composition teachers in all three locations, in London, in Rome, and in Wiesbaden whenever they lived there. So she was always getting the most expert professional composition training, which is wonderful. But her first 10 years of her music career was actually as a solo singer in London in a concertizing career. And she studied with some very notable teachers, Alberto Randegger and also Jenny Lind, the Swedish nightingale, who was incredibly famous at the time. And she actually, once she got married, decided to retire from singing and devote herself solely to her compositional life. And so that was when she began composing songs mainly for younger singers and for children. And she also began collecting songs in volumes that she believed would be good for training young singers' voices. In 1910, she toured the USA, but she was the accompanist for the premieres of her songs that other people sang. So she was taking it a little easy, which why not when you have that kind of fame at that point. And she became the first president for the Society of Women Musicians, which was an organization which allowed performers and composers who were women to have more opportunities to premiere and perform one another's works, because societally there were not that many for women. Then at 1913, she taught at the Guildhall School of Music, and she actually wrote a book about vocal technique. and I read a little bit about it, and it seems really interesting, so I'm definitely going to read that after this series is finished when I have a little bit more time, because she was a singer of some renown. This particular piece you'll be hearing was copyrighted and published in 1917 and was actually sung in 1920 by Amélie Tagali-Curci, who sung it as the encore for a recital that she had given in Philadelphia, and was a notable coloratura soprano at the Metropolitan Opera for many years. So Liza Lehmann had pretty excellent references in terms of performers who were performing her work. It was even advertised as being sung by Galli-Curci in a music magazine. So that was some good marketing for sure.
There are fairies at the bottom of a garden. It's not so very, very far away. You pass the gardener's shed and you just keep straight ahead. I do so hope they've really come to stay. There's a little wood with moss in it and beetles, and a little stream that quietly runs through. You'd never think they'd dare to come merry-making there. Well, they do, yes, they do. There are fairies at the bottom of our garden. They often have a dance on summer nights. The butterflies and bees make a lovely little breeze, and the rabbits stand about and hold the lights. Did you know that they can sit upon the moonbeams and snatch a little star to make a fan, and dance way up there in the middle of the air? Well, they can, yes, they can. Oh, those fairies at the bottom of our garden, you cannot think how beautiful they are. They all stand up and sing when the fairy queen and king come lightly floating down upon the car. Oh, the king is very proud and very handsome, and the queen, now can you guess who that would be? She's a little girl all day, but at night she steals away. Well, it's me, yes, it's me.
The next composer we'll be hearing is Betty Jackson King, who was born in 1928 in Chicago and who died at the age of 66 in Wildwood, New Jersey. She was a pianist, a singer, a composer, a choral conductor, and an educator at various levels, at the university level and at high school. But she was best known for her vocal works. She had composed various things, among them arrangements of spirituals, some of which Kathleen Battle popularized in her performances and helped to make Betty Jackson King's works more widely known. And she wrote a cantata, she wrote 3 operas, and the librettist for whom was her father, who was a pastor, and had introduced her first to hymns and gospel music. And these 3 operas were based on religious themes. She wrote 1 requiem, she wrote a ballet, she wrote chamber music, and she wrote pieces for piano and organ, as well as many, many songs. And she wrote notably a 3-song cycle based on the poems of the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. Ms. King is the only African-American composer represented on today's program, and all the more important to understand that she does it so very well. And later on in her life, actually, she ended up being the president of the National Association of Negro Musicians, which is still in existence today, and just in 2019 it celebrated 100 years of being an organization. She had first learned music from her mother, Gertrude, and actually her mother herself and her sister Catherine formed what was called the Jacksonian Trio, which was a singing group that toured around the country. So not only was she a composer, but she was also an experienced singer and a well-traveled musician. Her studies in piano for her Bachelor's of Arts and for her Master's of Arts in composing were done at Roosevelt University, and she also took further classes at Glassboro College, at Oakland Conservatory, Westminster Choir College, and Peabody Conservatory of the Johns Hopkins University, so that she could learn more and further develop her art. She taught at the university level at the University of Chicago, at Dillard University, at Roosevelt University, and she also taught high school music at Wildwood High School, where she received many awards from the governor of New Jersey for her teaching excellence. Let's hear this wonderful piece from Ms. King, who I think wrote something that captures the very essence of springtime, and since it is now springtime, what could be more appropriate? This next composer is Fanny Mendelssohn-Hensel, who was born in Hamburg and died in Berlin when she was 42 years old, unfortunately quite early. She had such an incredibly illustrious and well-viewed family lineage. One of her ancestors, Fanny Einstein, after whom she was named, held one of the most important salons in all of Vienna and was friends with people like the Kaiser and Napoleon and Goethe, and Mozart even stayed at her house for a number of months when he first moved to Vienna. So she was quite a notable woman, and it was into this kind of a very well-respected family that Fanny Mendelssohn was born. Her father was Abraham, a banker, and her mother was Leah, an amateur pianist who had actually studied piano with one of Bach's pupils. So the musical tradition of Bach's time was not so far removed from Fanny and from how she played the piano and thought about music. Given to her, of course, from her mother, who was her first teacher. She was such an excellent pianist, Fanny, that when she was 13 years old for her father's birthday, she played all of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier from memory, and the very next year at 14, she presented him with her first composition. Unfortunately, though, her father and her brother, Felix, who was 4 years younger, were against Fanny composing and composing for a living specifically, as well as publishing her works. So for a very long time, she was only given the opportunity to do her music in her private life in that way, versus Felix, who was given the keys to the musical world and allowed to become the famous child prodigy composer that we know now today from history. Fanny, however, because she was a woman, decided and was forced to decide that she were to be a wife and mother first and foremost, and so she married William Hensel, who was a court painter, and he was 11 years older than her, but they apparently had a very loving marriage, and he supported her composing by every day placing an empty sheet of manuscript paper on her piano, and at the end of every night asking to hear her new piece. She was herself a renowned composer and conductor, even though she was only able to perform in their family house, which was actually the garden house of her mother and father's estate. So they had a huge big room there with a domed ceiling, and she performed and premiered basically all of her pieces there. Of course, these concerts were open to the public as a salon, but she was never performing in concert halls or things like her brother was. She, on a vacation to Rome, met Gounod and introduced him to the works of Bach, and after which he composed his most famous Ave Maria, which was really cool. She was friends of Clara and Robert Schumann and went often to visit them, and she herself composed over 450 pieces, piano trios and quartets and solos, 4 cantatas, an orchestral overture, 125 solo piano pieces, and over 250 art songs. But of those 250 art songs, she only published 6 of those in her lifetime when she was 41 years old, 1 year before her death, and without her brother's permission. But she asked him in a letter afterwards, she hoped that it was okay, she said, and he basically said, "Oh, I'm so glad you did." And you know what? We're so glad she did too. So let's hear one of her pieces right now.
Das bedeutet Frühlingsstifte, alles fängt schon an zu blühen. Das bedeutet Frühlingsstifte, alles fängt schon an zu blühen. Jauchzen möchte weinen, Lenz und Liebe muss das sein. Alle Wunder wieder erscheinen mit dem Mond des Glanzes. Jauchzen möchte weinen, und der Mond die Sterne sagen, und im Tränen rauscht ein. Und die Nachtigallen schlagen, sie ist ein, ja, sie ist ein. Und die Nachtigallen schlagen, sie ist ein, ja, sie ist ein. Und der Mond die Sterne sagen, und die Nachtigallen schlagen, sie ist ein, sie ist ein.
The next composer we'll be hearing from is Teresa del Rigo, who was born and died in London at the age of 92. She studied composition with Paolo Tosti at the West Central College of Music in London, who was a very notable Italian composer. And she composed chamber music, pieces for piano, and orchestral works, but was most famous for her songs, her ballads, and her sacred music. And over 300 of her songs and ballads were published in her lifetime, which is incredible to consider, especially as a woman. And many of them were very popular, and they were actually sung by very famous singers as well, like Nellie Melba, for example. Her works were often recorded on records and appeared under many notable record label names, and there were actually, of her 12 most popular songs, there were 71 different records made of various arrangements. It wasn't just a singer and a piano, it was sometimes a big band doing an arrangement, or a soloist in an orchestra, or a violinist and a piano. The fact that her melodies were so mellifluous and catchy just made her pieces all the more popular and enjoyed by many, many people in this country and abroad. Unfortunately, her husband died in the First World War, and she therefore was often engaged in doing various charity concerts for the war effort after his death, kind of in memorial to him. She continued composing until she was 70 years old. So, if you're now curious to hear the piece that we have on our program today, which is called Homing, and which was most famously sung by none other than one of my favorite dramatic coloratura sopranos, Joan Sutherland, then here you go. I just wanted to add one more thing, since this is the final piece in our program, and that is, I've not been able to say nearly half of what is amazing about these women composers, and that you definitely should look into all of them and do your own research, because this is just scratching the surface of the wonderful things that they have achieved, as well as other women who aren't even on today's program. So please make sure to do your own research and to look for music of women composers, because it's incredible and it deserves to be listened to and to be given its place.
Weary of their roaming, and I would listen to thy side, hoping. Oh, dearest, I have wandered far, from daybreak to the twilight glowing. I come back with the evening star. Thou art my hunger and my need, the goal and solace of my roaming. Be thou my haven when I speed homing. All things come home at eventide, like birds that weary of their roaming, and I would hasten to thy side, homing.
If you would like to hear more music by our talented faculty and students, please join us this Sunday, April 25th from 12:30 to 2 p.m. for our virtual Brunch in a Bag watch party event here on YouTube. The program is free to watch, and you can RSVP at cmslv.org. Make sure to check out all the great items up for bid in our online silent auction, which is open now through 3 p.m. on Sunday. All proceeds from this annual event help a new generation discover the transformative power of music here at Community Music School.